In 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, an economist named Homer Hoyt published a study of one city's land prices going back a full century. Chicago. And inside 100 years of chaos, he found something that shouldn't exist. A rhythm. Land boomed, crashed, and boomed again, roughly every 18 years. Run that rhythm forward and it points at 1989. Then at 2007. Both were property peaks. So is there really an 18-year clock inside the housing market? And just as important, where does the clock stop working? The idea has deep roots. Back in 1879, the American economist Henry George argued that land speculation sits at the heart of boom and bust, because land is the one thing nobody can manufacture more of. Hoyt gave that idea data. Across a century of Chicago records, he counted 5 great land booms, spaced roughly 18 to 20 years apart. The swings in Hoyt's records were enormous. Land values could multiply several times over during a boom, then surrender most of the gain in the bust that followed. Each generation swore it had learned the lesson. Each generation repeated the sequence anyway. Decades later, a British economist named Fred Harrison revived the pattern. In the early 1980s, he used it to anticipate the UK property peak around 1989. Then, writing in the mid-2000s, he pointed at 2007 as the next one. On both counts, the timing landed close enough to make people uncomfortable. Harrison's version of the cycle has a shape. Roughly 14 years of rising prices, split by a mid-cycle wobble, then a final speculative surge, and about 4 years of bust. That's the pattern. Now let's test it against the world's biggest housing market. Start with the modern era. U.S. housing peaked around 1973, again around 1989, and again in 2006. That spacing of 16 to 17 years. Not a metronome, but close enough to be interesting. The 1989 episode was regional but real. New England and California saw years of falling prices, with some metro areas down 20 to 30% after inflation. Even Switzerland ran its own version on the same clock, a late 80s property boom that collapsed in the early 90s and sank a wave of regional banks. The UK peaked in 1989 too, and by the early 90s, over 1 million British households owed more than their homes were worth. Then came the big one. The fuel was textbook late-cycle credit. Lending standards collapsed, the U.S. homeownership rate hit a record of about 69% in 2004, and by 2005, roughly 40% of homes bought were vacation homes or investment properties. When the marginal buyer is a speculator, the cycle is old. The National Case-Shiller Index peaked in July 2006, and fell roughly 27% by early 2012, the worst national decline since the 1930s. Count 18 years forward from 2006 and you land in 2024. Which is why cycle believers spent the mid-2020s on high alert. What actually happened? A boom, then a freeze. National prices jumped roughly 40% between mid-2020 and mid-2022, while mortgage rates sat near record lows of about 2.7%. Then rates nearly tripled, touching almost 8% in late 2023, the highest since 2000. But instead of crashing, national prices went roughly flat. Sales collapsed, owners with cheap mortgages refused to move, and as of early 2026, no American crash had arrived. Score that as an open question, not a confirmation. Why would housing have a long cycle at all? 3 ingredients. First, land. Cities can't mint more of it where people want to live, so rising demand flows straight into prices. Second, credit. Homes are bought with borrowed money, and banks lend against collateral values. Higher prices mean bigger loans mean higher prices. The loop feeds itself, in both directions. Third, construction lags. From buying land to delivering homes takes years, so supply always arrives late. Economist Simon Kuznets documented building cycles of 15 to 25 years back in 1930. Long booms overbuild, long busts underbuild, and the clock resets. There's a psychological accelerant as well. Housing busts arrive roughly a generation apart, so the bankers and buyers at each new peak have usually never lived through one as working adults. The market's institutional memory expires on almost exactly the cycle's own schedule. Stack a slow supply cycle on top of a credit cycle, and you get something that looks a lot like Hoyt's 18 years. That's the theory. Here's the honest part of this video. Two of the world's richest housing markets ignored the script entirely. If the 18-year cycle were a law of nature, Germany missed the memo for 3 straight decades. From about 1980 to 2010, German house prices went essentially nowhere. After inflation, they actually drifted down. While the US, the UK, Spain, and Ireland rode 2 full boom-bust waves, Germany just sat there. Why? Roughly half of German households rent, so there's less speculative fever. Mortgage lending is conservative, with big down payments and no easy cash-out refinancing. Supply kept pace, helped after 1990 by a glut of buildings from reunification. Then the pattern finally showed up, late and compressed. With ECB rates at zero, German prices climbed roughly 60% during the 2010s boom, then fell back around 10% when rates jumped in 2022 and 2023. The lesson: the cycle isn't automatic. It needs loose credit and a culture of leveraged home ownership to breathe. Germany shows a cycle that barely starts. Japan shows one that never came back. In the late 1980s, Japan ran the biggest property mania of the 20th century. Land prices in the 6 largest cities roughly tripled in half a decade. One famous back-of-the-envelope claim said the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were worth more than all the land in California. Banks lent against land as if it could never fall. The excess became institutional. Lenders offered multi-generation mortgages stretching up to 100 years so families could afford bubble prices, and golf club memberships traded like listed securities. By one common estimate, at the peak, all the land in Japan was valued at roughly 4 times all the land in the United States, a country 25 times larger. It fell. The peak came in 1991, and then land prices declined for roughly 15 consecutive years. Commercial land in the big 6 cities eventually lost more than 80% of its value. On an 18-year clock, Japan was due for a new boom around 2009. Instead, prices were still scraping along the bottom. Only in the 2020s, 3 decades later, did Tokyo apartments finally set new records. What broke the clock? A shrinking population, banks stuffed with bad loans, and deflation, which makes debt heavier every year. A cycle can pause. Japan proved it can also flatline for a generation. So here's the honest synthesis. The 18-year cycle is real as a recurring dynamic, not as a schedule. It emerges wherever 3 conditions line up: scarce urban land, abundant mortgage credit, and a public that treats housing as a wealth machine. The US and UK keep regenerating those conditions, so they keep producing something like Hoyt's rhythm. Change the conditions and the pattern bends or dies. Conservative lending flattened Germany for decades. Demographics and deflation froze Japan. War and depression scrambled the clock in the 1930s and 40s. The pattern is a tendency with exceptions, and anyone who quotes the tendency without the exceptions is selling a story, not teaching a cycle. So treat the 18-year idea the way a sailor treats a tide table from a different harbor. It proves tides exist, shows roughly how they run, and tells you what to watch for. It does not tell you the hour of high water in your own port. Let's recap. Hoyt found an 18 to 20-year land rhythm in a century of Chicago data. Modern U.S. peaks around 1973, 1989, and 2006 fit loosely, and the UK fits too. The engine is land scarcity plus credit plus slow construction. But Germany sat out 3 decades, Japan flatlined for 30 years, and the American mid-2020s brought a freeze instead of a crash. Pattern, yes. Prophecy, no. If this kind of honest pattern hunting is your thing, subscribe. The whole point of this channel is to help you understand the next cycle before it arrives, counterexamples included. Next time, we zoom out to 100 years of commodity booms and busts. This is educational content only, not financial advice. Always consult a licensed professional before making financial decisions.